Welcome to DesiPod, your go-to destination for all things Desi. So, today's topic, controversial for many. Some say that masculinity, they associate toxic with masculinity. My point is that what do you think masculinity is, and is there an element toxic added to it? Is it because of the red pill movement that people are overseeing on social media, and as a result associate the two with masculinity being toxic, or can we differentiate the two? So this is going to be an interesting topic of conversation. I'm going to introduce my fellow speakers. I've got Abdurrahman and I've got Ishaq, the DesiPod team, and we are here to discuss this very, should I say, controversial yet fragile topic. Many may find it an uncomfortable topic to discuss because obviously in the day and age we live in, some might just be saying, well, masculinity is a topic that it's been there for centuries. And so let's start off with the first question. I'm going to pose it to you, Abdurrahman. So what is meant by masculinity? What's your take on it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe we can move on to the topic of toxic masculinity at some point. But it might be worthwhile just addressing what it is without that particular qualifier. Because there's a lot of misinterpretations, a lot of talk as to what that is and what that isn't. So masculinity for me, you know what, I have talked to a lot of people about it. It's weird. It's a kind of term that people think is easy to define, but it really isn't. Right? In my experience, if you ask 10 people about the word masculinity, you'll probably come up with 10 different answers. So it just comes to show how much variation there is and how much nuance there is. For me, I think, masculinity, if we talk about masculinity on one end and femininity on the other, masculinity, at least in my experience and my understanding, maybe we can associate certain words with it, right? So to be masculine, to me, would be somebody who is emotionally strong, somebody, of course, who's going to be physically strong, somebody who's in control of their emotions, somebody who is, a good decisive decision maker. That would probably be the common words associated with masculinity. And what is the opposite? Not opposite for that. What's the alternative to that? What's femininity, right? So femininity, maybe the common words associated with that is being caring, being supportive, having that softness about you that can be expected of a woman. So those are, I guess, the kind of two opposites, right? There's this physical strength, which is fairly obvious, it's part of being a man, but then there's also the emotional element and the ability to keep your emotions in check and in control, at least in my mind, is part of it. Happy to expand that a little bit later on, but I think that's it. And if we were to go with that particular ideal, this is going off on a slight tangent, but if we're going to go with that particular ideal, you can imagine how difficult it is to maintain and uphold that, right? So what does it mean for somebody to be emotionally strong? Because then you have to, if you're in a family environment, and you're considered to be the man of the house, right? Then that means that you have to put on that image of always being in control of your emotions. And that's very difficult to do, even if you're not necessarily married. From a societal, social point of view, you're expected to, again, always be in control, right, of your emotions and things like that. So it's definitely not an easy ideal to live up to, but those are the things that I think for me would be commonly associated with masculinity. I think this is a nuanced issue. We'll address other things as well, but yeah, that would be my take.
Fantastic answer. I like that idea of how you brought in the emotional side to masculinity. A lot of people have this misinterpretation of masculinity being purely a person who is physically powerful, a person that goes to gym, a person that really has some form of rage within themselves. Somebody might consider them as being macho. That's that term that's loosely followed. But having that self-control over your emotional side or the aspect, and I think it's pinnacle in this day and age. You need to be an individual who has their emotion in check, is a person who values other people's opinion rather than enforcing their opinion on others. So yeah, you are right. We can touch on the topic of toxic masculinity later in the conversation if we get a chance. But yeah, Ishaq, the same question to you. What is masculinity? What does it mean to you? And do you have any experiences or do you have any examples that you could share with the audience about this issue, this topic?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, isn't it? Masculinity. What do we mean by masculinity? So to me, it signifies, those behaviors, those attitudes that basically people link back to being a man. And I think it's interesting how what you said earlier, I interpreted that as, well, in essence, what we're referring to is being a male, being a man. It entails those rough around the edges, uh, sort of behaviors, those sort of attitudes. Whereas being a bit more feminine is more about being more caring, being more rounded. And it's interesting how societal actual perception of that has evolved over the years, partly because of people evolving, partly because of other intrinsic and extrinsic factors. But it's interesting because how we interpret a man and how we interpret the role of a man has changed. And I think if you were to ask many people, being a man is in essence about being the breadwinner. It's about being just the backbone of a family, and almost taking one for the team. But again, it's interesting because many years ago I came across a podcaster who specialized in the whole issue of how being a male in the 21st century was becoming more difficult because that role of the man had evolved. So you go back 100 years, 50 years, even 20 years, the man of the house, the father, the eldest son, whoever, was always seen as the breadwinner, as a person that will support a family. And obviously, as more and more people have entered the workplace, partly because of need, because if you look at inflation and you look at all these other external factors, it's that whole image of a family and the whole need of that model has changed. We've moved away from having single income households to where both husband and wife work, where both husband, wife and children work, and that role has become less of being a breadwinner and more of being uh, a supportive figure. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that has changed. So I'll actually bounce that question back to you. How do you see that changing, Hasnain?
Interesting. And I was trying to digest exactly what you were saying and the whole idea of roles changing in society from just say 20 years ago to 10 years ago. I mean, we are living in a ever evolving, fast-paced society where the whole role of masculinity or femininity, I think, is become very fluid now. Fluid in a sense where the woman, if she's a single woman, she can raise a family and have those masculine traits where she is strong, she's mentally strong, she's able to support the people that are dependent on her. And then you've got the male side of it, where it's not just purely based on physical prowess or being that individual who comes across as the breadwinner or the person that is the focal point of the family. I think it's become really complicated. There is no, for me personally, I'm looking at it now from a holistic point of view, I don't think there is a definitive differentiation between the two. Now, that might sound weird to some, but I think in this day and age, I think both men and women can share some masculine traits and some feminine traits. I mean, saying that a woman can only be caring and nurturing, I may see that as something a man could obviously carry as well. A man could be caring and nurturing. There are individuals who are probably single fathers out there who do need to have that side within themselves. So yeah, it is a very complicated issue. And I know masculinity is getting a bad rep out there. So for me, to define masculinity, it's not as easy as it is. It's there's a lot more to it. But for me, being a gentleman, being a person that shows chivalry, a person that's respectful, a person that knows their boundaries or sets boundaries, a person that understands the idea of respecting each other's needs and wants, a person that is going out and going above and beyond to help others, a person that is an individual who really wants to make a difference, in my opinion, is defined as being a masculine man. But I could be wrong, but that's my personal opinion. Now, let me reiterate, that's my personal opinion, that's my take on it. It's all subjective. I mean, there isn't a definition. There is a definition in the dictionary, but obviously it's evolved. We live in a society where things are so totally different and perceived differently, and people might see it in how they perceive the world. But for me, yeah, it is a difficult topic in terms of defining it. So that's my take on it at the moment, that it's up to you and your own perception of how you see masculinity being. I'm just going to ask you another question related to masculinity. Do you think in this day and age now, if you look back 20 years ago, do you think the role of a man has changed drastically to the point where there are statistics to prove? Now, I don't have the numbers to hand, so I do apologise, but I will find this case study where I did read it past, where a lot of men are finding it difficult and are in a lot of pressure now to live up to that expectation of being a man, a person who's a breadwinner, a person who... So would you want to add anything to that? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm glad you raised it. So has there been a drastic change if we were to consider the central tenet of masculinity as somebody being a primary breadwinner? Then I'd say, yeah, that has significantly changed, because fast forward 20 years, females are equally as educated, equally as capable, equally as skilled to be primary breadwinners. And some families may very well have females that are higher earners than men, and that's perfectly acceptable and normal. And as you said, Isaac, there are economic factors where both the husband and wife, for example, are expected to work just to make ends meet. So it's hard to say, well, actually, masculinity is only about that. But I do also think that, despite the social changes and cultural changes, there is still something intrinsic in the human psyche and the emotional makeup of a man and a woman. And I think that's still there, regardless of social and cultural changes. So I'll kind of give you an example of this. And again, it is purely based on my own experience and what I've come across, and it may not be representative of the wider population. So I am still looking for marriage. I have been going through the matrimonial process, various different things, whether that's matrimonial websites and whatever else. And I have met a lot of people through that process. I've looked at a lot of profiles as well. One of the common themes that I see coming across in the meetings that I have and in the profiles that I'm exposed to, that their expectation is for the man to be the head of the household, for the man to be the leader, for the man to be the breadwinner, the protector, the man to be the primary decision maker in the household, right? So you can imagine, in modern day society, 2024, that has been certainly my experience of the kinds of things that females want from a man. So it's really interesting to see that element is still there, right? And these people, for example, certainly the ones that I've met, are very intelligent, very educated. Some people are solicitors and lawyers and dentists and pharmacists and doctors. So they are very, very educated in and of themselves, but they still have this kind of underlying expectation for a man to be a certain way. So I think in that sense, in terms of roles, absolutely, it has significantly changed. And a man is no longer perfect. It's no longer exclusive to a man to be a primary breadwinner, but the emotional makeup, i.e., the expectation for a man to be emotionally strong, physically strong, being a leader, being in charge, seems to still be there, at least in some circles. There may be variation in that, but that's my take.
And so just following on from what you just said, in terms of that emotional makeup and something that was alluded to earlier, it's men have typically always struggled with their emotion. It's almost seen men don't cry, men don't. There's certain sympathetic and caring things that have almost historically have been associated away from masculinity. I think as time's evolved, men have become more and more openly caring. Men have always been caring, but we've been caring deep down. We don't necessarily cry as much. Where there'll be time to cry, men often get frustrated and react differently to what one would expect. But as time has changed, that has changed. Do you think, and this links back to a conversation we had not so long ago, do you think this impacts on the emotional well-being of men because we don't always express how we're feeling? So whether we've gone through a bereavement, whether we are going through other times of conflict, and the list goes on. but we don't always express that in a healthy way. Sometimes we just keep that buried in. I remember talking to a chap a while ago. We were talking about bereavement. This was during the height of COVID. And during the height of COVID, I was like, actually, you know what? We all know death is a certainty, but you know, this is something else. We need to talk about this. And I remember talking to all my male colleagues and male friends. They were like, well, actually, you know what? If I lost a loved one, I'd want to, you know, get the funeral over with and just move on. That summed up to me how, as blokes, we are wired, because we don't want to get into that nitty gritty and that emotional stuff because we find it uncomfortable. So is that part of masculinity? Has that changed? Do you think
So
it needs to change? And
So I'll quickly come in on that, if I may. I'm interested to get Asden's
that's it.
perspective on this as well.
So right.
So what I would say though, and it's a really good point, Isaac. Like I said, because men are expected to be emotionally strong, there is that ideal that males generally, you know, young males, old males, are expected to kind of live up to, which in practice means that you sometimes have to bottle up the emotions that you consider to be emasculating, right? That make you less of a man. So you know you have to be careful with that, right? So expressing your emotions, expressing sorrow, expressing sadness, expressing whatever is considered to be, you know, a negative emotion is harder to do for a man. So if you, the other example I'll give is that for females, for example, it's perfectly fine to express those emotions, right? Within their social circles, they'll have those open conversations about how they feel, let alone the activities and things that they're, you know, doing with each other, shared activities and social activities. But they are expected, and also, sorry, not just expected, but encouraged to express their emotions and how they feel. Whereas if you were to do that as a man amongst your friends, it's not conducive to the camaraderie, you know, that men go through to bond themselves and bind themselves together. So if you start expressing negative emotions, likelihood is you might run the risk of being mocked or ridiculed or whatever, or somebody's just going to change the subject, right? And then if you were to go in a family environment and you're the head of the household and your spouse expects you to be the strongest one emotionally, and your children also expect you to be the strongest one, you have literally no outlet then to really express those emotions, right? So that can be a real challenge, and then all those emotions bottle up, and goodness knows what they end up as. Added to that, there's also issues around mental health and people seeking out mental health services. So I was reading an article from the BBC, I think, where even within the NHS, their waiting times on mental health services is up to 7 years or something. So you know, men will have the social support, not necessarily the family support, specifically to express their emotions, and even mental health services can be limited. So you can imagine the kind of challenges that a male will have growing up in this society, and even old males as well.
Interesting point, and I'm gonna touch on something that you said, and I'm gonna bounce that to Hasnain about us being that fear of being ridiculed. Is it a fear of ridiculed, or is it when we encounter, you know, emotion amongst other males, that almost masculinity wired approach that we have, is that we get embarrassed and we want to run from that sort of stuff. So immediately that whole fight light response, we go into flight mode because like this is uncomfortable. There's tears here, man. I'm running away. What do you think, Hasnain? Do we deal with the emotional stuff well? Do you think that's the part of masculinity that we're currently finding difficult as society has changed?
I think it comes down to case merit now, and the reason I say that is each and every person has their own ability or their own way of processing emotions. And prime example, when you mentioned about bereavement, I can recall a situation where I was faced with an immediate loss of a loved one. I was actually in Pakistan at the time, and prior to going to Pakistan, I got a call saying that my uncle was, I spoke to him the night before, he was fine. I wake up in the morning and I get the news that, well, he's gone into some sort of coma. And that itself was a shock to me. But I had to keep strong mentally at that point because my mother and my family were all obviously upset, distraught. So for me, my processing at that point was, okay, I do not know what's going on in my head. Is this a dream? Is this something that I can't? Is this really happening? But I remember actually being at his when we were actually in Pakistan, and unfortunately when he did pass away, I was overlooking his body, and I couldn't feel anything at that time, and everybody around me were all obviously tearing up and showing their emotions. For me, I just went numb. And that was my way of processing it. And I remember distinctively a relative of mine put their arm around me and said, "Are you okay?" And I was like, I just don't know what to expect. I don't know what's going on in my head. And for me, I was really young at that time. But what I'm trying to say is, I think everybody has their own way of expressing their emotions. Now, somebody might see me in that situation and say, "Oh, he's holding up. He's a strong man. He's holding up for his family." But for me, at that point, I had no way of expressing. I did not know what to do in that situation. So bringing my point down to next point is, I think it's really important to have some form of brotherhood in the sense that you have got friends and as an outlet to speak up to about your issues. And I don't want it to be perceived to be not a masculine thing to share your feelings with your fellow friends or your brothers, because I think you need to have an outlet, because if you bottle it in, then it's only a more amount of time when that just explodes and you think to yourself, well, where did that come from? And then you lash out. And I think there have been cases where people have been perceived to be so strong to the point where they just let loose, and then it just cascades into a massive thing. So yeah, it's good to have people as an outlet to speak out, and you need to have that around you. So yeah, it's a complicated one, this, really. When I was just thinking about, when I was listening to you both speak about the whole roles of men in society and has it changed? Yeah, it has changed. It will obviously change again. We might revert back to how things were before, where if you're a man, you need to deal with a certain level of stress. But now there is no, the lines have been blurred. Women have those traits where they are physically and mentally strong as well. So I don't want women to think, well, it's not just only men who are physically and mentally strong, we're the same. So yeah, it's complicated, Isaac. Very complicated in that respect.
Yeah, it's the whole, and this illustrates just how a society, our viewpoint of men has evolved. And I was reflecting as both of you were speaking, that there was a time when certain roles in society, for certain jobs, you would associate more to men, and some you would associate more to women. Think of growing up. How many male teachers did you have versus how many female teachers you had? How many times, how often would you see a male nurse, for instance? And dinner ladies. Actually, I'm reflecting there. To this day, I don't think I've seen a dinner man. But is there a reason why you can't have a dinner man? And that those attitudes of society, and we've all grown up with these, and they learn behaviors. They do change as society evolves, because you just look at women in football, now women in sport, how that's evolved. And likewise, you would have certain industries that were more dominant by men, and it's becoming a more plateaued out. So you've got the career aspects, you've got educational aspects. How again you're getting men and women going into different specialties based on their own preferences, their own unique interests. So yeah, I think that's been a really interesting conversation. Abdurrahman, any closing thoughts from yourself based on our conversation?
No, closing thoughts is just in summary about how difficult it is to define masculinity, and everybody probably has their own definitions. But there is historically there always has been a certain expectation of men to be a certain way. I think that's amplified in social media messages. It's amplified now. Various different movements that have taken place. I'm not going to mention them in specific, but you can imagine there's a lot of exposure now for men to be a certain way, whether that's from fellow men or whether that's from women, whatever it is, there is always that kind of amplified perception of how you should be, and it is very 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 challenging to uphold and to meet that ideal, even more so for a younger person, right? Still trying to figure out their identity and their place in life. So you can imagine, hearing from older figures about how they should be and how they should not be, and how challenging that is for them. But just kind of going back to Hassan's point about, the fact that males should be made to feel comfortable to express their emotions as much as they desire and want, right? Because you can be the most macho, quote unquote, masculine man possible, right? Full of strength, physical, emotional, and otherwise. And you can project that image to yourself and to others as much as you want. But one fact still remains is you're a human being and you have emotions that are always going to fluctuate. They're going to go up and they're going to go down. And even though, you may not necessarily want to display those down emotions, you still feel them. And if there's no outlets to express them in a way that's healthy, then chances are they are going to bottle up and cause all sorts of problems and issues, which as human beings, ultimately you'd want to avoid. So yeah, it is important to express your emotions and recognize the humanness within you, whether you're male or female.
Excellent. Hassan, any closing remarks from yourself before we bring this one to an end?
No, it's just reiterating and echoing what you guys have said, is the fact that it's a complicated topic to discuss now. There is a textbook definition, but how wide we've evolved as a society, we've evolved as the world has gone on, where you can't really pinpoint what masculinity is now. The minute if you talk about how things were in the past, then that would probably be perceived as being toxic in that respect. So it would be interesting to see what our female counterparts would probably want to address this masculine issue. And like Abdul Rahman, you were on about the whole marital issue, and what would do women actually perceive what masculinity means to them. So hopefully leading to our next podcast in the future, it would be really interesting to see that what's their take on it. But in generally, just for a closing statement, I would just say a man has got to have a code or a creed to live by, no matter his job. I believe that's a really strong quote. If you live by your ethics, you live by your code, and you live by what you believe it to be right, I think that's, in a sense, a way to live your life, just to be true to yourself. And that's all I've got to say to end. It's been a great conversation, boys. It's not as easy as I thought it would have been initially to talk about this topic. I mean, this podcast could have lasted an hour or more. Hopefully, in the future, if we do get a female's perspective onto this topic, will be a valuable insight.
That's it. And thank you both, and thank you to our listeners. Till the next time. Thank you.